Jim's eyes widened in horror as a dense wall of fog began creeping up in the distance. Before he could even think, a deafening siren ripped through the small town, and seconds later, the thunder of military jets cut across the sky. Acting on instinct, he grabbed his girlfriend and tried to get her out of there. But halfway through their escape, a sudden car crash left her bleeding badly, and there was no way she'd make it to a hospital. To make matters worse, Jim noticed strange figures watching him from the roadside. With no other choice, he dragged her to the nearest shelter, a deserted barn. He slammed the door shut and immediately switched on the television, desperate for answers. At 7:30 this morning, a chemical plant in the town exploded, releasing a toxic fog that refuses to dissipate. Reporters confirmed that anyone who inhaled the fog transformed into a mindless killer. Military biohazard units deployed to the scene were suddenly attacked by local residents, and all communication from the disaster zone has since gone dark. Jim's girlfriend's life was slipping away by the hour, and outside, something inhuman waited. Luckily, Jim found a sharp axe and a rifle for protection. He then climbed to the roof and carved out a massive SOS sign, praying rescue teams would see it. That night, a faint noise jolted him awake. Lantern in hand, he crept through the shadows until he found the back door wide open. He slammed it shut and began sweeping the hallways. As he passed his girlfriend's room, his heart shattered. Her body was already cold. Forcing himself to keep moving, he found muddy footprints streaked across the floor, and before he could react, an infected lunged at him. His rifle flew from his grip as the two wrestled violently. Jim freed himself and scrambled up into the attic, listening as the creature prowled below. His rifle lay just out of reach on the floor. Fueled by pure adrenaline, Jim leapt down, snatched the rifle, and fired wildly. Gasping for breath, he slumped against the wall. Then, the shrill ring of a telephone cut through the silence. He rushed to answer and found another survivor on the line. The man was calling from the warehouse across the street. He'd heard the gunfire and urged Jim to join them. Jim gave one last glance at his girlfriend's lifeless body, then slipped into the night and dashed across to the warehouse. At the door, a man introduced himself as Scott. When the outbreak began, he and his wife had taken shelter here. The warehouse was massive, stocked with food and water, a fortress for survival. Jim noticed a girl standing silently in the corner. Scott explained they'd found her wandering days ago, but she barely spoke and trusted no one. By now, official reports confirmed the full horror. The explosion had released a toxic gas carrying a virus that drove people insane. Jim knew the plant well. It had once been the country's largest chemical facility, shut down years earlier for making illegal weapons. If one of those old tanks had ruptured, the result would be far worse than anyone expected. Scott didn't care about the cause. All he cared about was the swarm of infected outside, making escape feel impossible. But Jim believed it was only a matter of time before the military cleared the area and rescued them. Until then, the real priority was learning how many infected prowled nearby and exactly where they were hiding. That night, the strange girl couldn't fall asleep, so she wandered the warehouse until she found Jim sitting alone, still drowning in grief over his girlfriend. For the first time, she opened up. Her name was Nine. She admitted she had always been rebellious. At school, she never had friends, and at home, she often clashed with her parents and spoke to them harshly. A few days earlier, when the toxic gas disaster struck, her parents were killed by the infected while trying to save her. She never even got the chance to apologize, and deep inside, Nine believed she was the one who should have died. But Jim told her that she had to live, not just for herself, but for her parents too. Otherwise, their sacrifice would be meaningless. For the first time in days, Nine felt something heavy lift from her chest. She was about to thank him when a gunshot echoed from downstairs. The two rushed to investigate and found someone pounding on the warehouse door. Jim ordered the girls into the office and crept forward with his rifle raised. Outside stood a middle-aged woman crying in pain and begging to be let in so she could find her daughter. Jim flicked on his flashlight and realized she was infected. Without hesitation, Jim fired through the door. The Gorup realized that the infected were evolving. They weren't just mindless killers anymore. They were learning to mimic survivors and disguise themselves. The military, realizing this was far from over, began digging in for a prolonged battle. They started airdropping supplies all across town, hoping scattered survivors could hold out a little longer. Suddenly, Scott's voice called from below, telling Jim to listen carefully. A fleet of planes were passing overhead. Without thinking, Scott opened the door, waving and shouting for help. Sure enough, Scott was blindsided mid-shout, tackled by one of the infected. Jim grabbed the nearest plank of wood and swung with all his strength, but it barely slowed the creature down. Scott was about to be torn apart until Jim remembered the iron axe on his belt, and with one brutal strike, he brought the creature down. They sprinted back inside and slammed the door behind them. Jim was furious, berating Scott for his recklessness. But before Scott could snap back, Nine suddenly collapsed to the floor. Everyone froze, but Jim immediately suspected something. He rushed upstairs, rummaged through her backpack, and found an insulin injector. Nine was diabetic, and she'd likely run out of insulin. The nearest pharmacy was deep in town, swarming with infected. Scott then remembered the earlier supply drops. One crate had landed just a kilometer away. No one knew if it had insulin, but it was their only chance. Jim spread out the map, studied the infected clusters, and realized the risk, but he couldn't let Nine die without trying. Scott climbed to the roof with his rifle, while Jim prepared by the warehouse door. At least 4 infected blocked the path, but Scott picked them off one by one with headshots and cleared the way. When he gave the signal, Jim sprinted from the warehouse, and after weaving through the fields, he reached the crate. Heart racing, he tore open the medical kit and found insulin. But before he could breathe relief, an infected staggered into view. It hadn't noticed him yet until Scott's voice crackled on the radio, drawing the creature's attention straight to him. Jim quickly raised his weapon and fired. His shot hit the leg instead of the head. The infected collapsed but was still alive. Remembering Scott's words that they're not human anymore, Jim aimed again and put a bullet through its skull. Back at the warehouse, Nine regained consciousness after receiving the insulin injection, though she was still weak. Meanwhile, during his routine patrol inside the warehouse, Jim noticed a sewer cover had been pushed open, and wet black footprints trailed away from it. Upstairs, Scott was half asleep when he spotted a shadow moving. Thinking it was just Jim, he lowered his guard until the figure lunged at him. Jim burst in at the last second, kicked the creature off Scott, and pinned it beneath a bed frame. The others barricaded themselves in the office while the infected prowled outside. When the creature burst through, Jim fired without hesitation and killed it instantly. None of them dared to leave the office until morning. At dawn, Jim crept outside carefully, but after only a few steps, he heard faint movement. He rushed forward, only to be confronted by several soldiers in hazmat suits. Before he could speak, a dart struck his neck and darkness swallowed him. When he woke up, he was in a treatment center. Once cleared of infection, a senior officer explained that every supply crate had a tracking device. The moment Jim had opened the medical kit, it pinged their location, allowing the military to find the warehouse so quickly. His desperate mission to save Nine had ended up saving them all. Scott and his wife had already been relocated to the base, and Nine was recovering in intensive care. When she woke and looked out the window, she saw a courtyard full of rescued survivors. For the first time, it seemed the nightmare might finally be over.